Welcome to Serenity Fire, the podcast where wellness meets grit. I'm your host, Krista Guagenti, founder of Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique. Join me as we dive into the intriguing world of biohacking, clean living, cutting-edge spa trends, and the hustle, grind, and grit of entrepreneurship. From my personal battles with weight management, infertility, and a 30-year journey to create and launch my dream business, to building a sanctuary for those who have been touched by cancer, I'm here to share real talk, inspire big dreams, and spark a passion for holistic living inside each and every one of you. So let's dive in. Welcome back to Serenity and Fire. I hope you enjoyed my last episode on how hormone therapy may actually be the missing piece to the puzzling question of why you just don't feel like yourself anymore. But have you ever noticed how the hormone conversation seems to make everyone angry, or at the very least, super frustrated? One provider says that you should only use bioidentical hormones, while another might say there's no meaningful difference. And then some people will say that hormones didn't work for them, while others will say that hormones completely changed their lives. And yet many people say that hormones are dangerous, while many others say that kind of scare tactic is just marketing. If you're sitting there trying to figure out what's actually true, I'm here to help, because the reality is that today's hormone conversation is definitely filled with strong opinions, confusing terminology, and a lot of information that gets repeated without being fully explained. So today we're going to simplify it. What does bioidentical actually mean? What does synthetic actually mean? Why were synthetic hormones created in the first place? And if bioidentical hormones are structurally identical to the hormones your body naturally produces, why wouldn't you just start there? Also, why do hormones work for some people and yet not for others? So let's get into it. But before we get started, I want to say something to the men who are listening today. You may hear words like estrogen and progesterone throughout today's conversation and think this episode and this topic just isn't for you. But I'm asking you to stick with me, because the exact same bioidentical versus synthetic discussion exists in men's hormone optimization too. In fact, many men are surprised to learn that much of modern testosterone therapy today is already based on the idea of delivering hormones that more closely mimic what the body naturally produces. So while some of today's examples do focus on women, the bigger concepts absolutely apply to everyone. So let's get started with the basics. Many people hear the word bioidentical and immediately assume that it means natural, organic, chemical-free, safer, and healthier. But that's not actually what bioidentical means. Bioidentical refers to the structure of the hormone, and that's it. A bioidentical hormone is structurally identical to the hormone your body naturally produces. For example, bioidentical estradiol has the same molecular structure as the estradiol produced by women's ovaries. And bioidentical progesterone has the same molecular structure as the progesterone naturally produced by the human body. And testosterone can be bioidentical as well. If we look at these hormones under a microscope and compare them to the hormones naturally produced by the human body, the molecular structures would match. So again, bioidentical doesn't mean natural, it just means structurally identical. And that's an important distinction, because many bioidentical hormones are actually still manufactured. They don't come straight from a plant and just magically end up in a prescription bottle. Many are derived from plants such as soy or wild yams, but then they are processed, purified, standardized, tested, and manufactured into medications. The key isn't where they started in this conversation. The key is what the final molecule actually looks like, because ultimately the body doesn't care where the hormone originated. The body responds to the molecule itself. So for me, the question becomes, if I have an option of using a hormone that's identical to what my body naturally produces, then why wouldn't I just start there? I think that's a completely reasonable question, and it's one that many hormone specialists have asked themselves over the last several decades. The theory is actually fairly straightforward. If a hormone looks exactly like the hormone your body naturally produces, the body may recognize it more naturally, at least in theory. And it may interact with receptors differently, perhaps more optimally, and it may also be metabolized differently, and it may behave differently with certain tissues. And because of that, many practitioners have become increasingly interested in therapies that more closely mimic human biology. Now, does that automatically mean that bioidentical hormones are always better? Not necessarily. And I think that's where context really matters, because medicine isn't about finding the best hormone. Medicine is about finding the best option for a specific patient. And this probably leaves you wondering, okay, Krista, if bioidentical hormones are structurally identical to human hormones, Why wouldn't everyone just use them and never use synthetic hormones? And that's a fair question. And in many situations, bioidentical hormones are exactly what practitioners will choose. But there are circumstances where another approach may be appropriate. For example, insurance limitations, cost considerations, availability, delivery method preferences, and unique medical circumstances. And that's why I think it's important not to become attached to labels. The goal isn't to become loyal to a hormone. The goal is to become loyal to the patient. Now let's talk about synthetic hormones, because the word synthetic has developed a reputation that isn't necessarily always deserved, at least in this instance. Many people hear synthetic and immediately think fake, toxic, dangerous, unhealthy. And in many instances, that is the case. But in this particular topic, that's not what synthetic necessarily means. A synthetic hormone is simply a hormone whose molecular structure differs from the hormone naturally produced by the human body. Different structure, different molecule. So the next logical question then becomes, why were synthetic hormones created in the first place? The answer is actually pretty practical. Historically, some naturally occurring hormones were difficult to manufacture. Some synthetic hormones offered greater stability, some lasted longer in the body, some were easier to standardize, and some could be patented, which encouraged pharmaceutical development and research. Scientists weren't trying to create inferior therapies, they were trying to create usable therapies. And at that time, these were important medical advances. Now, some of you may be wondering the same thing I was wondering when I learned of all of this. If naturally occurring hormones were difficult to manufacture decades ago, why are bioidentical hormones so common and prevalent today? Well, the answer to that is also quite simple. Technology improved, manufacturing improved, analytical chemistry improved, our understanding of hormone biology also improved. And what may have been difficult or impractical 50 years ago may be relatively straightforward today. Medicine evolved, technology evolved, and the ability to manufacture bioidentical hormones has evolved right along with it. The point is, the fact that something was difficult 50 years ago doesn't mean that it's also difficult today. So another question that many people often ask is, if my insurance won't cover a bioidentical hormone, will a synthetic hormone actually work for me? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And that's important because if synthetic hormones didn't work, they never would have become widely used in the first place. Many women have experienced meaningful symptom relief using synthetic hormone therapies, and many men have too. The question isn't, do synthetic hormones work? Because they often do. The better question really is, do they behave in the same way? Because working and working identically are not necessarily the same thing. And I love that distinction because that's really what this conversation is all about. Synthetic hormones can absolutely work. The question we are talking about today is whether they behave identically, and those are not necessarily the same thing. So here's how I personally think about it. If my insurance only covered a synthetic option, would I refuse treatment? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. Because synthetic hormones can definitely be effective and they've helped many, many people. But if I have two reasonable options available to me and one is structurally identical to what the body naturally produces, I think it's reasonable to ask why I wouldn't start there. And that doesn't mean that bioidentical hormones are perfect, but it also doesn't mean that synthetic hormones are bad. It simply means I'm interested in therapies that more closely resemble human biology whenever possible. So the answer to today's question is this: bioidentical versus synthetic does matter, but synthetic hormones can definitely work for you as well. Now the question becomes, is there a bioidentical option that might more closely mimic what my body was designed to use? Which leads us to the question of whether or not bioidentical hormones are less stable or shorter acting than synthetic hormones. And the answer to that is not necessarily. Some synthetic hormones were specifically designed to last longer, resist breakdown, improve convenience, and allow less frequent dosing. But that doesn't automatically make them better. It simply makes them different. And keep in mind that longer lasting doesn't always automatically mean superior. Sometimes convenience matters, sometimes adherence matters, and sometimes mimicking natural physiology matters. The best choice really depends on the patient and the goals of the patient. Now let's talk about progesterone, because this is where a lot of confusion in this whole conversation begins, more specifically around the terminology surrounding progesterone. You'll often hear terms like progesterone, bioidentical progesterone, micronized progesterone, progestins, and Provera. And many people assume that these terms all mean the same thing, but they actually don't. So let's start with progesterone itself. Progesterone is a hormone naturally produced by the human body. Bioidentical progesterone is progesterone that has the same exact molecular structure as the progesterone that your body naturally produces. Simple. Now let's talk about micronized progesterone, because many people think that bioidentical progesterone and micronized progesterone are different hormones, but the term bioidentical describes the hormone, while micronized describes the delivery. Bioidentical refers to structure, micronized refers to particle size. Those two are completely different concepts. So imagine that you have two identical gold bars, same gold, same purity, same composition. One remains a solid bar, while the other is ground into extremely fine powder. The gold itself didn't change, only the particle size changed. And that's essentially what micronized does. And you may not know this, but natural progesterone isn't absorbed particularly well when taken orally. So scientists developed this process called micronization to make progesterone particles much smaller and thereby improving absorption through the digestive tract. The hormone remains bioidentical. The structure doesn't change, but the particle size does. So micronized doesn't mean modified, it means miniaturized. And when many providers discuss oral progesterone therapy today, they're often talking about micronized bioidentical progesterone, not one or the other, but actually both. Now let's talk about another term called progestins. Progesterone and progestins are actually not the same thing. A progestin is a synthetic compound designed to mimic some of the effects of progesterone, but it is not progesterone. And when we get into the WHI study, this topic will be an important one. So tuck it back into the back of your brain and put it in a place where you'll be able to pull it out when we get to that study. But going back to progestin, the molecular structure of it is different from progesterone. The way it interacts with receptors can be different, the way it metabolizes can be different, and the effects throughout the body can be different. One of the best known examples is medroxyprogesterone acetate, also known as Provera. And this is where the bioidentical versus synthetic discussion starts becoming more relevant, because we're no longer comparing progesterone versus progesterone. We're comparing bioidentical progesterone versus synthetic progestins. And small differences in molecular structure can sometimes produce meaningful differences in biological effects. So now that we've established what bioidentical means, what synthetic means, what micronized means, and what progestins are, this brings us to the question that really probably matters most. And that is, if these hormones are different, does that difference actually matter in the real world? And that's exactly where we're headed in the next episode. But before we wrap up today's episode, let's look at what we've learned. We've learned that bioidentical doesn't mean natural. It means structurally identical. We've learned that synthetic doesn't automatically mean dangerous. We've learned that synthetic hormones can absolutely work. And we've learned that when people talk about hormones, they're often talking about very different molecules that may behave very differently inside the body. We've also explored why many practitioners have become increasingly interested in therapies that more closely mirror human biology. But that still leaves some very important questions unanswered. Questions like, does any of this actually change outcomes? What about breast cancer? What about testosterone? And what about men on TRT? What about the Women's Health Initiative? And does hormone therapy really increase cancer risk? Or did we oversimplify a much more complicated story when it comes to cancer and HRT? That's exactly what we're going to tackle in our next episode, because understanding the difference between bioidentical and synthetic hormones is only half the story. The other half is understanding how one study in particular changed the hormone conversation for both men and women, and why we're still talking about it more than 20 years later. So as we close today's episode, know that my goal with Serenity Fire and of course Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique is to help you create a life where you can function better, age differently, and remain fully engaged in the people and experiences you love most. And I think this conversation on hormone replacement therapy is a big part of that conversation. So stay with me and tune in next week to hear the rest of this story. And please always remember that everything we share on Serenity Fire is meant for general information and inspiration purposes only. The topics we discuss are not intended to diagnose, treat, or replace personalized medical care. So please always consult with your healthcare provider regarding your individual health concerns, laboratory results, medications, and treatment decisions before trying anything we talk about on the show. Your health is unique and your care should be too. Okay, that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to Serenity Fire. If today's episode inspired you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Until next time, protect your peace, lead with integrity, and keep balancing serenity with fire. I'm Krista Guagenti, and I'll talk with you more in our next episode. At Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique, we don't just offer traditional spa treatments. We create rituals that relax your mind, restore your health, and rejuvenate your spirit. From biohacking technologies to advanced oncology-trained care, everything we do is designed to help you heal on the deepest level with clean, holistic therapies, products, and amenities that are second to none. And right now, you can experience two of my favorites, our whole body LED light bed or hyperbaric oxygen therapies. And as a thank you for listening, you'll get 10% off your first session when you use the code Serenity10 at booking. What is your panacea? Let us help you find it, because true wellness isn't a quick fix, it's a ritual.